If you think this is a simulation, you haven't felt the cold yet, Marcus Hale said, his voice steady over the low hum of failing lights as frost crept along the metal floor in thin, silent lines, and Kaylee's Rin stood perfectly still inside the chamber, her luminous blue skin reflecting the sterile glow, her mind cataloging everything as controlled variables, temperature dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, atmospheric pressure stable, no visible interface, but clearly an underdeveloped system by her standards. Primitive, she thought, watching the human trainees move through the haze with slow, deliberate steps, their breath visible in the air, their gear rattling softly with each motion. Nothing about them suggested urgency, only repetition, only discipline, and that confused her more than any advanced technology could have, because where she came from, training was efficient, clean, simulated, no wasted motion, no unnecessary discomfort. But here a young soldier stumbled, catching himself against a steel barrier, and Marcus didn't rush to him, didn't shout, didn't intervene. He simply watched, then nodded once, as if the moment itself mattered more than the outcome. Again, he said, and the word echoed like a command carved into stone. Kaylee's tilted her head slightly, her internal analysis struggling to assign purpose to inefficiency. You are introducing uncontrolled variables, she stated, her voice calm, precise, almost curious. Marcus didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her with anything more than a slight shift of posture. We call that reality, he replied, and the trainees moved again, crawling under low beams, their movements slower now, more careful. One of them paused, just for a second, and Marcus stepped forward, not to correct, not to punish, but to hand him a canteen, their fingers brushing briefly. A quiet exchange, no words, just presence. Kaylee's felt something unfamiliar register in her system, not error, not anomaly, something else, something she couldn't quantify. Pain response is unnecessary for skill acquisition, she insisted, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the human more intently. You could simulate optimal conditions. Marcus finally looked at her then, his eyes not cold, not hostile, just certain. We're not trying to be optimal, he said. We're trying to be ready. The lights flickered once, the hum deepened, and somewhere beyond the chamber walls, a distant vibration rolled through the structure. Subtle, almost ignorable, but Kaylee's noticed. Of course she noticed. Her species noticed everything. Your system is unstable, she said, more firmly now. You should reset. Marcus's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, then shifted back to the trainees. There is no reset, he said quietly, and for the first time since she arrived, Kaylee's Rin felt something slip through the cracks of her certainty, something that didn't belong in any simulation she had ever studied, something that felt real. The vibration came again, deeper this time, not loud but present, like something vast shifting far beneath the structure, and Kaylee's adjusted her stance automatically, her senses sharpening as thin lines of frost cracked along the wall panels, and the overhead lights dimmed by a fraction of a second, a fluctuation too small for most species to notice but impossible for her to ignore. Your environmental controls are degrading, she said, her voice carrying a sharper edge now, less analytical, more urgent. Marcus did not answer immediately. He moved past her instead, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor as he checked each trainee with a glance that was quick but deliberate, not counting them, not inspecting them, simply acknowledging them, and one by one they straightened. Even the one who had stumbled earlier, their movements slower now, heavier, but more precise. You are continuing despite system instability. Kaylee's pressed, following him, her glowing veins pulsing faintly under her skin as her internal readings recalibrated again and again without finding a stable baseline. This reduces training efficiency by 40%. Marcus stopped near the center of the chamber, his breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment he said nothing, just listened, not to the machines, not to the flickering lights, but to something else, something beyond the walls. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried further. Efficiency does not keep people alive. Kaylee's felt that same unquantifiable sensation again, stronger this time. Like a variable she could not isolate, She turned toward the nearest wall where a thin seam had begun to glow faintly orange. Not bright, not dangerous, but wrong for a controlled environment. That is not part of your simulation parameters, she said, stepping closer, her hand hovering just inches from the surface. Feeling the subtle warmth radiating through the metal, Marcus followed her gaze, his expression unchanged, but his shoulders tightened just slightly, almost imperceptibly. No, he said. It is not. Behind them. One of the trainees shifted his weight, glancing toward the same wall, then back to Marcus, waiting, always waiting, and Kaylee's noticed that too. The way they looked at him, not for instructions, not for permission, but for confirmation, as if his presence alone defined what was real. You should terminate this exercise, she said, more firmly now. There is a risk threshold being exceeded. Marcus finally turned fully toward her, and there was something different in his eyes now, not emotion, not fear, but clarity, the kind that did not need explanation. There is always a risk threshold, he replied. Then he looked past her, toward the trainees, and gave a single, small nod, and they moved again, not faster, not more aggressively, just forward, steady, controlled. Even as the hum deepened and the lights flickered once more, Kaylee's system struggled to reconcile the data, because nothing about this matched a simulation profile anymore. There was no adaptive correction, no safety override, no artificial boundary, only continuation, only choice. And for the first time since entering the chamber, she did not try to calculate the outcome. She simply watched and listened and began to understand that whatever this was, it was not designed to be survived perfectly. It was designed to be survived at all. The warmth at the wall spread slowly, not like fire, but like pressure building behind something that was never meant to move. And Kaylee's felt it through her fingertips before she even touched the surface, a low, steady vibration that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. This is no longer contained, she said, her voice quieter now, less certain. As the thin orange seam pulsed once and then faded, as if breathing, Marcus did not rush, did not issue commands. He simply stepped closer to the line of trainees and adjusted one soldier's stance by a fraction of an inch, a hand on the shoulder, firm, grounding. Then he moved on, as if the shifting environment was just another variable to be absorbed, not avoided. You are ignoring a structural anomaly, Kaylee's insisted, turning to face him, her eyes brighter now, her internal systems cycling faster, searching for protocols that did not exist here. In any advanced system this would trigger an immediate shutdown. Marcus paused beside her, close enough that she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing, controlled, deliberate. That is the difference, he said, not looking at her, but at the trainees who continued forward, step by step, their boots scraping softly against the metal floor. We do not shut down. Another subtle tremor passed through the chamber, stronger than before, and this time even the trainees felt it, a slight shift in balance, a glance exchanged, but no one stopped. No one broke formation. They adjusted, adapted, continued. And Kaylee's realized that was what unsettled her the most. Not the instability, but the absence of panic, the absence of correction. You are teaching them to operate under failure, she said slowly, the realization forming as she spoke. Marcus nodded once, a small movement, but absolute. Failure is the only constant, he replied, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of movement, breath, the faint hum of systems struggling to maintain control. Kaylee's looked down at her own hand, the faint glow of her veins steady but faster now, her physiology responding to stimuli it could not categorize, and she understood something else then, something deeper than the data. These humans were not being prepared for a perfect environment. They were being prepared for an imperfect one where nothing aligned, where systems faltered, where conditions changed without warning. This is inefficient, she said again. But the words felt weaker now, less like a conclusion and more like a question. Marcus finally turned to her fully, and there was no challenge in his expression, no need to convince, only certainty. It is honest, he said, and the words settled between them, heavier than any technical explanation, because honesty could not be optimized, could not be simulated, it could only be experienced. Another flicker of light passed overhead, longer this time, casting the chamber into brief shadow before returning to its dim glow, and Kaylee's felt it again, that shift inside her, the slow erosion of certainty, the realization that whatever system she thought she was analyzing had never been a system at all. It was something else, something unstructured, unpredictable, and real. And as she looked back at the trainees moving forward through the cold, through the instability, through the unknown, she understood that they were not learning how to perform, they were learning how to continue, even when nothing around them made sense. The next tremor did not pass quietly. It lingered, a low sustained pressure that bent the air itself into a subtle distortion, and Kaylee's felt her balance shift by less than an inch, but enough to matter, enough to register as something no controlled system would ever allow. Her gaze snapped upward as the ceiling panels flickered again, this time longer, stretching the shadows across the chamber until every movement looked slower, heavier, as if the space itself was resisting them. This environment is deteriorating beyond acceptable limits, she said, but there was no authority left in her tone, only observation, only the need to name what she could no longer control. Marcus moved past her without urgency, his hand brushing along the cold metal railing as he walked, grounding himself not in data but in contact, in presence, and the trainees followed, one step, then another, their formation no longer perfect, but still intact, still moving. You are continuing without stability, Kaylee's added, her voice softer now, as she watched one trainee pause for a fraction of a second, adjusting his footing, then continuing forward without waiting for instruction. Marcus stopped beside him, not correcting, not intervening, just standing there for a moment, sharing the space, then moving on, and Kaylee saw it clearly this time. The pattern she had been missing. They were not relying on him to fix the environment. They were relying on him to remain within it. You are not controlling them, she said, almost to herself. Marcus glanced back at her briefly, a faint exhale visible in the cold air. I am not supposed to, he replied. Another flicker rolled through the chamber, followed by a deeper vibration that resonated through the floor, and this time a thin line of light split across the far wall, not wide, not catastrophic, but undeniable, a boundary that had not existed before. And Kaylee's felt a sharp spike in her internal readings. Not pain, not damage, but something close to alarm. That is a structural breach, she said, stepping forward instinctively, her hand rising as if she could measure it, contain it, define it. Marcus did not stop her, but he did not follow either. He simply watched, and behind them, the trainees slowed, not stopping, just recalibrating their movement, their breathing, their spacing, adjusting to the new variable without waiting for it to be resolved. Kaylee's hesitated just inches from the glowing line, her fingers hovering, sensing the subtle heat, the instability, the unknown, and for the first time, she did not know what would happen if she touched it, not because she lacked data, but because there was no data to access, only reality, only consequence. In a simulation, she said slowly, her voice almost lost in the hum. This would be corrected before interaction. Marcus's voice came from behind her, steady, unchanging. In reality, he said, you learn before correction. Kaylee's lowered her hand slightly, her gaze shifting from the breach to the trainees, to their steady movement, to their quiet acceptance of what was changing around them. And something inside her shifted with it, a recalibration not of systems, but of understanding, because they were not waiting for the environment to become safe, they were becoming capable within it. And as another tremor rolled through the chamber, stronger now, more insistent, Kaylee's realized that whatever she had come here to observe had already changed her, not through explanation, not through instruction, but through exposure to something her world had never allowed, uncertainty without protection, and the choice to keep moving anyway. The light along the fractured seam pulsed again, brighter now, not violently but insistently, like a signal that refused to be ignored, and Kaylee's drew her hand back fully this time, not out of fear, but out of something more complex, recognition, her internal systems still searching for parameters that no longer applied, while behind her the steady rhythm of boots against metal continued, each step measured, each breath visible in the cold air. They are adapting without instruction, she said. Quietly, almost to herself, Marcus stood a few feet away, watching the line of trainees as they moved past the shifting wall, his posture unchanged, grounded, as if the instability was simply another part of the terrain. "They are adapting because of instruction," he replied, and Kaylee's turned slightly, studying him again, not as a variable, not as a subject, but as a source, something she had not considered before. "You have not issued commands," she pointed out, her voice steady but searching. Marcus shook his head once, a small motion. "Not today," he said. Another tremor moved through the chamber, stronger now, causing a subtle shift in the overhead structure, a low metallic sound echoing through the space. And this time one of the trainees hesitated longer than before, his footing uncertain for just a moment. Kaylee's watched closely, expecting correction, intervention, some form of external control, but Marcus did not step in. Instead, he simply stood where he was, visible, present, and after a second, the trainee adjusted on his own, shifting his weight, finding balance, continuing forward. And Kaylee's felt that unfamiliar sensation deepen, not confusion now, but something closer to understanding. "You are removing dependency," she said slowly, the realization forming with each word. Marcus exhaled, the faint cloud of breath dissipating between them. "We are building it," he answered. Kaylee's gaze moved across the chamber, taking in the details she had overlooked before, the small corrections, the quiet endurance, the way each human seemed to carry their own weight without waiting for the system to support them. And she saw the pattern now, not imposed, not enforced, but internalized. "In my world," she said after a moment, her voice softer, more reflective, "we eliminate uncertainty before exposure." Marcus glanced at her briefly, then back to the trainees. "In ours," he said, "we expose before certainty." The distinction settled heavily in her mind, not as a contradiction, but as a divergence, two fundamentally different approaches to survival. Another pulse of light ran along the seam, followed by a faint expansion, barely visible but measurable, and Kaylee stepped back. Instinctively, her body responding before her analysis could catch up. "The structure is continuing to shift," she said, this time not as a warning, but as a fact. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging it without reacting to it. And then he stepped forward, moving closer to the fracture, not to fix it, not to contain it, but simply to stand near it, to understand it, to exist alongside it. And Kaylee's watched him, truly watched him now, the way he did not rush, did not resist, did not retreat, but also did not ignore. He accepted the change and adjusted his position within it. And something inside her aligned with that observation, a new framework forming where the old one had failed, because this was not about control, it was about capacity, not about preventing failure, but enduring it. And as the chamber continued to hum, to flicker, to shift around them, Kaylee's Rin realized that the most significant change was not happening in the environment, but within her own understanding, as she began to see that survival was not a system to be perfected, but a condition to be faced. The next shift came without sound, a silent drop in pressure that made the air feel thinner, sharper, and Kaylee's noticed it immediately as her breath slowed by instinct rather than command, her body adapting before her analysis could fully process the change. The glowing seam along the wall dimmed for a moment, then surged brighter, stretching wider by less than an inch, but enough to alter the geometry of the space. And this time the trainees did not just adjust, they changed formation, spacing themselves out without being told. Their movements deliberate, conserving energy, maintaining balance. "They are anticipating," Kaylee said, her voice low, almost reverent now. Marcus stood near the fracture, his eyes tracking the subtle changes not in the wall, but in the people. "They are remembering," he replied. Kaylee's turned to him, her expression shifting, no longer detached, no longer purely observational. "From previous simulations?" she asked, still holding onto the last fragment of her original framework. Marcus shook his head slowly. "From previous reality," he said, and the distinction settled deeper this time, not as a contradiction, but as a correction. Another flicker passed through the chamber, longer now, casting the entire space into a dim, uneven glow, and for a brief moment, Kaylee's could not clearly see the far end of the room, her vision compensating, recalibrating, but not perfectly, never perfectly. "Your visibility is compromised," she noted, but the words felt unnecessary even as she spoke them, because no one stopped, no one hesitated. They adjusted again, lowering their center of gravity, moving with more caution, more awareness, not because they were instructed to, but because they understood, and Kaylee's felt it again, that internal shift, but stronger now, more defined, as if something within her was being rewritten in real time. In my world, she said slowly, her voice softer than it had ever been. We would not allow this level of uncertainty to persist. Marcus glanced at her briefly, then back to the trainees. In ours, he said. We assume it will. Another subtle tremor moved through the floor, less violent than before, but more constant, like a condition rather than an event, and one of the trainees reached out, steadying himself against the wall for just a second. Before continuing, and Marcus stepped closer, not to assist, but to mirror the action, placing his own hand against the same surface, feeling the vibration, acknowledging it, sharing it, and Kaylee's watched that small gesture with an intensity she had not felt before, because it was not about correction, it was about connection, not between systems, but between individuals. You are not isolating them from failure, she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. Marcus exhaled slowly, the cold air turning his breath into a faint cloud that lingered for a moment before fading. We are teaching them they are not alone in it, he replied, and that was the moment something inside Kaylee's Rin finally aligned, not logically, not systematically, but intuitively, because she understood now that what she had been observing was not a training protocol, not a simulation environment, but a philosophy, one that did not seek to eliminate uncertainty, but to endure it together. And as the chamber continued to shift, to hum, to flicker around them, she no longer searched for the reset, no longer expected the correction. She simply stood there, breathing the same thin air, feeling the same unstable ground. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not feel like an observer. She felt like a participant. The next change did not come from the walls or the floor, but from within Kaylee's herself. A tightening in her chest as her breathing adjusted again to the thinning air, slower now, deeper, more deliberate, and she realized she was doing it without conscious command, mirroring the humans around her, learning without instruction. The chamber hummed with a low, constant vibration, no longer a disturbance, but a condition, something that existed rather than something that happened, and the trainees moved through it with a rhythm that was no longer imposed but internal, each step measured against the instability beneath them, each breath timed with the shifting pressure. This is no longer observation, Kaylee said quietly, her voice steady but changed. Marcus stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he had been waiting for that realization. It never was, he replied. Another flicker passed through the lights, longer this time, leaving the chamber in near shadow for a full second before returning. And in that brief darkness, Kaylee's felt something she had never experienced before, not fear, not confusion, but reliance, not on systems, not on certainty, but on presence, on the movement of others around her, on the sound of breath, on the subtle shift of weight as the trainees continued forward. And when the light returned, nothing had changed except her understanding of it. You placed me here intentionally, she said, turning to Marcus, her eyes searching his, not for data, but for confirmation. Marcus nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. You asked to study us, he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only fact. Kaylee's held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the chamber, at the fracture that had widened slightly again, at the trainees who had adjusted their path without hesitation, moving around it, not avoiding it, but incorporating it into their movement. This is not a training environment, she said, and this time it was not a question. Marcus exhaled slowly, the faint cloud of breath drifting between them. No, he said, it is not. The words settled into her with a weight that no simulation could replicate, because they carried consequence, not theory. Another subtle shift moved through the floor, and Kaylee's adjusted her stance instinctively, her balance aligning with the movement rather than resisting it, and she felt it clearly now, the transition from observer to participant, from analysis to experience. Then what is it? She asked, her voice quieter now, not demanding, but seeking. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, as if measuring not her understanding, but her readiness. It is where we learn what we actually do, he said. And the simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any complexity could have, because it left no room for abstraction, no space for simulation, only action, only response, only reality. Kaylee's turned back toward the trainees, watching as one of them slowed, his breathing uneven for just a moment, and without being told, the one beside him adjusted pace, matching him, not to assist, not to intervene, but to remain aligned. And Kaylee's felt something shift inside her again, deeper this time, something that could not be measured or categorized, because it was not part of any system she had ever known. It was something human, something shared. And as the chamber continued to hum, to flicker, to shift around them, she realized that the most profound difference between her world and theirs was not technology, not capability, but acceptance. The acceptance that reality would not wait to be understood before it demanded a response, and that survival was not about predicting the future, but enduring the present, together. The chamber settled into a strange kind of balance, not stable, not predictable, but consistent in its uncertainty, and Kaylee stood among them now, no longer at the edge, no longer observing from a distance. Her breathing matched the rhythm around her, slow and deliberate. Her posture adjusted to the subtle shifts in the floor without conscious effort, and when the lights flickered again, she did not look up immediately. She waited, listened, felt the space before reacting. "You changed," Marcus said quietly from somewhere to her right, his voice calm, almost reflective. Kaylee's turned her head slightly, her glowing eyes softer now, less analytical. "No," she replied. "I adapted." Another pulse ran through the fractured seam, this time accompanied by a faint sound, not loud, but new, a soft strain in the structure that had not been there before, and the trainees responded instantly, not with panic, not with urgency, but with adjustment, widening their spacing, lowering their center of gravity, preparing without being told, and Kaylee's moved with them, her body aligning with the pattern as if it had always known it. "This is no longer unfamiliar," she said, more to herself than to Marcus, and he nodded once, acknowledging not her words, but her state, the shift from resistance to acceptance, from analysis to participation. "It never needed to be familiar," he said, "only survivable." The words settled into her with clarity, because she understood now that familiarity was a comfort, not a requirement. And as the chamber hummed and shifted around them, she realized that her own people had mistaken control for safety, certainty for survival. Another flicker passed through the lights, longer again, casting the room into shadow for a heartbeat. And in that darkness, Kaylee's did not search for visual data. She listened to the movement, to the breathing, to the subtle coordination of those around her. And when the light returned, she was already moving, already aligned. "You trained them to trust each other," she said, turning toward Marcus, and for the first time, there was something like respect in her voice, not forced, not calculated, but earned. Marcus shook his head slightly, a faint hint of something softer in his expression. "We trained them to stay," he replied. Kaylee's paused at that, the distinction settling deeper than anything before it, because staying meant enduring, meant not leaving when conditions degraded, meant facing the unknown without retreat. And she looked again at the trainees, at the way they moved together without dependency, without hesitation, each one responsible for themselves, but aware of the others, connected without being controlled. And she understood now why there had been no reset, no correction, no intervention, because intervention would have broken the very thing they were building. "And if they fail?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. Marcus's gaze shifted briefly to the fracture in the wall, then back to her. "Then they learn," he said simply, and there was no weight of consequence in his tone, no fear, only acceptance. And that was what struck her the most, because in her world, failure was something to be prevented, avoided, erased. But here, it was something to be faced, absorbed, transformed. Another low vibration rolled through the chamber, steady now, almost constant, and Kaylee's adjusted her stance without thinking, her balance aligning with the movement, her breathing steady, her awareness expanded beyond herself, and she realized that she was no longer waiting for the system to stabilize. She was stabilizing within it. And as she stood there, surrounded by humans who had learned to move through uncertainty without needing it to disappear. Kaylee's Rin understood that she had crossed a threshold she could never reverse, because she no longer saw their methods as primitive. She saw them as honest, and honesty, she realized, was far more difficult to survive. The chamber did not return to normal. It never tried to. The hum remained low and constant, the fractured seam along the wall glowing faintly like a scar that would not close. And yet everything inside it continued, not perfectly, not smoothly, but steadily, and Kaylee stood among them as the trainees completed their final pass, their movements slower now, controlled, deliberate, each step placed with intention rather than certainty. The lights flickered one last time before stabilizing into a dim, quiet glow, not restored, just settled, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no new shift, no new variable. Only the aftermath of what had already changed. Marcus moved through the line, not inspecting, not correcting, just present, his gaze meeting each of theirs briefly, a silent acknowledgement that required no words. And when he reached Kaylee's, he stopped, not as an instructor, not as a subject, but as someone who had shared the same space, the same uncertainty. "You understand now," he said, and it was not a question. Kaylee's held his gaze, her luminous eyes reflecting the faint light of the chamber. But something in them had changed, something quieter, deeper. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm, steady, but no longer detached. There was never a simulation. Marcus nodded once, a small motion, but final, and Kaylee's looked around the chamber again, really looked this time, at the uneven light, the imperfect structure, the lingering hum that never fully faded, and she realized that nothing here had been designed to convince her. Nothing had been staged or controlled for her observation. It had simply been real, and that was what had changed her, not the difficulty, not the instability, but the honesty of it, the absence of illusion. "In my world," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful now, "we build systems to prevent this." Marcus followed her gaze across the chamber, then back to her. "In ours," he said, "we build people who can face it." The distinction settled into her fully now, no longer something to analyze, but something to carry, because she knew she would take this understanding back with her, not as data, not as theory, but as memory, as experience, the kind that could not be simulated. And as the trainees began to file out, their steps quiet, their movements calm, there was no sense of completion, no signal that the exercise had ended, only the understanding that it would continue somewhere else, in another place, under different conditions, because this was not a single event, it was a way of being. Kaylee's took a step forward, then another, matching their pace without thinking, and for a moment, she paused, looking down at her own hand, the faint blue glow steady beneath her skin. Then she looked at Marcus one last time. "You do not train for control," she said, and he shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. Kaylee's gaze shifted toward the fractured wall, then back to the path ahead. "You train to remain," she said, and this time, Marcus did not answer, because he did not need to. And as she walked out of the chamber with the others, the hum fading behind her, but never truly gone, Kaylee's Rin understood something that no system in her world had ever taught her, that survival was not the absence of failure, not the presence of certainty, but the quiet decision to stay, even when nothing promised that you should. And for the first time, the alien did not analyze the humans. She remembered them.